So, Aaron, I thought we'd maybe start chronologically and we'd start with your journey and what led up to you transitioning. Was it 15 years ago now?
I think it was 15 years. Though I feel like I've been saying 15 years for the last 3 years. So, but
Well, the years
yeah,
kind of
it's
merged together the last few months.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's been about 15 years. I mean, how I describe it now is probably quite different than how I would have described it, even 5 years ago, because I've learned a lot about what gender dysphoria is over the last couple of years. So I'll describe it using some of the terminology as I understand it today. So I had what I would call sorry, I have what I would call early childhood onset gender dysphoria. From it started about age 3. So as soon as I was able to start categorizing males and females into separate categories, I started to experience it. Of course, I had no language to describe it. It was very confusing. But whenever I was confronted with a situation in which I had to figure out which category I belong in, so anything from going to a toy store where toys are categorized male or female, or choosing clothing where there's a boys section and there's a girls section, or at school when you tell all the boys line up on one side of the gym and all the girls on the other. So all of those kinds of situations where I had to make a cognitive decision to categorize myself. That's when it would come up and cause me confusion and distress. Because I just had this sense that I couldn't explain that I belonged in the male category for some reason, even though I knew
Mm.
that technically wasn't true. I still had this just persistent, relenting drive or feeling that was the case, and that some kind of mistake had been made. So that's I think a fairly, when we think of a trans person or a kid, that's often the narrative that we think of, is just these kids that from a very early age demonstrate extreme gender nonconformity. And my parents would say the same thing. It wasn't, I mean, I didn't discuss it with them. They didn't know my internal struggle, but they certainly knew that I just had this persistence to always appear like a boy, to the extent that in elementary school I was registered on a boys baseball team for a season, because people that didn't know me personally and didn't know my family thought that I was a boy. And that continued throughout my childhood. There were definitely periods where I tried to just kind of cooperate with societal norms and appear more feminine. I tried to do that to fit in, but it felt very inauthentic to me. My high school grad, I wore a dress just because I wanted my parents to be able to have their photographs and appreciate that moment. And but I felt like a drag queen doing that. So that was sort of, in short, my childhood experience. I mean, things like if I went swimming and I would just see all the other boys, they wore swim trunks, and that's what I wanted to do. There were times I went swimming with just a pair of shorts on and no shirt, as a child, before my body developed, of course. But it was when puberty and my body developed that things became extra distressing, because
Mm.
my mind had mapped my body according to how I saw myself. So my mind had people, a lot of trans men even talk about having experienced like a phantom penis as though it had been amputated. So our minds sometimes map, when you have this type of gender dysphoria, it maps your body according to your self perception. And so I experienced my own body as having a flat chest and stuff. And so when I started to develop breasts in adolescence, it felt like tumors attached to my body, because it didn't fit with how my mind had mapped my body. So sort of the reverse effect, I think, of like a phantom sensation if a body part had been amputated. When I was 19, I was having a lot of all through adolescence. I was having a lot of gynecological problems, and when I was 19, I eventually had a diagnosis. I had a very large internal cyst that was causing me problems, about the size of a grapefruit. And so I went and had surgery to get that removed. It was attached to what was believed to be an ovary at that time. And when it was removed, the surgeon said, the cyst had damaged my internal organs to the extent that they had to just remove some of the internal organs, because they couldn't differentiate between the cyst and the organs. And they did a biopsy on the ovary at that time, and it came back no cancer or anything, but it came back having been an ovotestes, which is like a it's like a hybrid ovary testicle. It contains tissue of both. The surgeon at that time just reassured me that it was gone. It is a cancer risk when you have one. So it is a very, very rare disorder of sex development, or what people might more commonly understand as an intersex condition. So I didn't know I had it up until that point. There had been no external signs that I had an intersex condition. My testosterone levels had always been high, but I didn't know that I had this DSD until I was 19. But he just sort of brushed it under the rug. He said it's gone, so it's not going to cause you any more problems, and so don't worry about it. And he didn't know that I experienced gender dysphoria. So when I learned that, in my mind, the gender dysphoria and that condition were somehow related. I am also same-sex attracted. I lived my early adult life in the lesbian community and met a lot of very masculine butch lesbians at that time, and started to make sense of it as this is something that some gay and lesbian people experience, that we are masculized or feminized for some reason, both in our mind and bodies. So I didn't give it much more thought than that. I mean, it was still something I struggled with that never went away, but that's how I understood it for many years until I saw a documentary on TV. So I would have been about 33 at that time. I think it was 2005 or 2006. I saw this documentary on mainstream television about trans kids. And they were just, the kids were telling their stories, and their stories sounded identical to mine. This early childhood onset, persistent experience of cross-sex identification. And they said that the way that the documentary was framing that was, if you have these experiences, it means you are a trans person. So I don't think they talked about that. Back then it was gender identity disorder, not gender dysphoria. So back then they didn't talk about that disorder. They just said, if you experience this, you're a trans kid, and these kids were all transitioning. So I thought, okay, well then that explains my experience then, because that is absolutely, they described my experience to a T. And so it was very easy to convince me then that because I had these experiences, that it meant I was a trans person, as like this separate category of personhood. And so I bought that, and very quickly, went to a gender clinic and said, look, I have these experiences and I saw this documentary, so I must be a trans person. And they heard my experiences and said, yeah, I mean, you must be a trans person. And I didn't understand what gender dysphoria really was at that time. I didn't know any of the medical literature. And I was started on hormones, and I did go through an assessment process over several months. So back then there was an assessment process before hormones, and then again before any surgery. So I was evaluated by a psychologist again before I had any surgeries done. So that's it in a nutshell in terms of how I just sort of arrived at the medical transition.